My name is Daniel. I'm gonna get things started here today as soon as we get pulled up. Right, so obviously we're gonna be talking a little bit about perfectionism. I understand that this is a recurring theme, that there are students who are kind of having struggles with this and kind of maybe they're not turning in a homework or they're putting things off because they're trying to get things perfect, um, and battling with this. So we're going to go ahead and try to look at some ways that we can, one, understand the places that this might be coming from first, and then from there kind of breaking it down into some of the different things that we can think about as we're working with these students to maybe try to help them along with this. Okay.
And Dan is going to be our main presenter today. He has a specialty in working with people who have anxiety, especially for athletes, has been in a college counseling center setting for the last year, is working on his licensure here at Connick and Associates. And so he has a lot of experience in working with students in this particular realm.
All right, so first, looking at kind of the ways that this comes about, okay? We have other-oriented perfectionists, which obviously there's expectations coming from outside of ourselves, right? Now, this can come from different places. A lot of times it can it can come from teachers. It can come from just like the school process in general. It can come from parents, different family members, kind of setting these unachievable standards for them. That's going to make them put that pressure on. And then, other students, other people, it's just they put the pressure on themselves. So we have self-oriented perfectionists. And then we also have socially prescribed perfectionists. And this can come from different areas too, with the way that social media is, or, I even like to think of this as, okay, comparing, just any kind of comparison to others, any of those, side influences. If we're watching, Instagrams or TikToks of these students doing really well or whatever, you're going to continue to maybe put that pressure on yourself, to again try to strive for bigger and greater, and which isn't wrong per se, but it does become a problem then, when it's unreachable for yourself, or you're trying to compare that to others instead of yourself. So moving forward with that, we're going to break that down a little bit further. Again, kind of looking at these causes, okay? Some of it does have to do with self-esteem. And some students may find that kind of their sense of self, or, their sense of worth comes from this type of achievement. So then with that, it's going to continue to perpetuate those types of standards, right? And it's going to be harder and harder to live up to that, when it's like you have this set expectation in your mind of like, if I don't reach this level of perfect, if I don't perform and get this done in a certain way, then it somehow removes value from myself. Again, another one, going back to kind of parents, right? Setting high standards. This can even be more subtle though. This can be something as, I'd say it pretty common for parents to kind of make clear some expectations for their children, right? They are going to tell what they need or what they hope their child can achieve, or what they want for their child, which, even if that is in more of this kind of subtle, like unintentional way, it can still leave this overarching perception that it's like, okay, I don't want to disappoint my parents now. I do need to live up to some standard here. And again, going in those other influences, right? Believing that somehow perfection or constantly viewing others um, in this kind of light that's like, oh, this person got into the school they wanted to. This person's doing what they, their dream, and maybe I'm not there or don't feel that I'm there. So I'm going to continue to put that pressure further on myself. Right. And especially on an education level, I know that there is a lot of pressure, right? Of like, oh, worrying about where am I going to go to school? I have to get into this school or that school, or, I'm not going to get a good job if I don't get the good grades and I don't do perfect on this. Right. So there's a lot of ways that this continues to kind of flood in and feed that mindset. Um, and like I said, again, sometimes it is simple as like, okay, if maybe these are students who have achieved very highly for their whole educational life, it can get to a point too where, well, if all of a sudden something's hard or something's challenging and, I'm not doing perfect at it, well, then who am I, right? Like, what am I if I'm not, getting straight A's? What am I if I do bad on this paper when I've never done bad on a paper before? Um, so that can bring a lot of issues on. It can bring a lot of anxiety and even some depression with that if that continues to kind of be perpetuated. Um, so going forward, we're going to talk about then what are some things that we can do to help, right? So I have this broken down into a few different things. The first thing that we can try to start being mindful of as influences on these students is language. Language goes a long way, in the same way how I kind of previously mentioned that even just, like I said, okay, parents maybe set expectations for their children, right? Even if that's not done in any kind of aggressive way, it still leaves this overarching, perception of needing to reach some standard, right? In the same way, the language that we choose to use, you know, can have very subtle or direct effects. So we'll talk more about that. Then there's a couple activities that I think, and there's a wide array of things, but we're going to talk about a few that might be helpful, to kind of take away from that for a minute, reassess, come back. We're going to be reframing some of the ways we're looking at things, reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see, and then we're going to talk about being vulnerable ourselves at the end. Okay. So starting off, we'll go into this language piece here. So, like I said, this goes a long way. It could be anything from word choice to even just the tone of delivery, right? And again, these are things that may be unintentional. Um, you know, it's very easy, I'd say, for, maybe something comes off wrong and you don't mean it to, or whatever, but being mindful of kind of like the way in which things are said can make a difference. And then word choice. Okay. Specifically when we're looking at somebody who has kind of a perfectionist tendency, there's going to be kind of holes in the language, right? It's like saying things like, well, this is good enough. It's like, it doesn't need to be perfect. Okay. That's rational, right? In that sense. But to that student, that's not a thing, right? This is good enough can sound like, so it could be better, right? So there is something to be better. I'm not meeting my standard. So even little things like that can play a big role. Instead, kind of using more of like a reinforcing language, instead of saying like, this is good enough, just simply leave it as, you're doing really good. This is so good. Leaving it at that can have more of a positive effect where it's like, okay, I have this appraisal for this work I'm doing, and I'm not left with the impression necessarily that there's some gap that I have to, reach over in order for it to be what it needs to be. Or I understand that the situation, um, at Fusion with the curriculum is very kind of individualized, so there may not be room to play for this, but even looking for ways to kind of like, okay, you did such a good job, maybe I can use this as an example for somebody in the future or something, right? Little things like that, again, are going to leave that student with this feeling of achievement instead of not reaching the bar. So instead, again, kind of bringing in that language where mistakes are just happy accidents, right? And that, they're really, we have to make mistakes, right? Mistakes is part of the learning process. This is good. If we never made mistakes, how would we? Perfection is impossible as it is, but we can't ever get better without making these mistakes, right? Um, so that's part of the reframing of that as well. So I'd encourage everyone to try to just think of some other things, and I obviously everyone has their own way of kind of doing things and running what they run. Um, but I do think too, sometimes we kind of have um, our own scripts that we tend to follow, right? Think kind of common appraisal things that we say, common responses to certain situations. Um, so I just heavily encourage trying to think about that. What are the things that I am often saying? Is there a way for me to take this and kind of reframe it in a way so it does sound a little more rewarding instead of there is a gap to bridge here? Okay. Go ahead and move on to the next part here. Some activities. One activity that can be really good is called a bounce back box. This is an opportunity to kind of appreciate those moments that there was a feeling of, oh, I made a mistake. Oh, I didn't do good enough. And you can kind of work with a student to reflect on their own journey and kind of write their own, you know, and you can put it in this bounce back box. So the next time that a situation comes up where they're in that place, maybe, well, let's reflect on our bounce back box. We can look at some of those things that we thought were a barrier in the past, you know, um, and we can reflect on the fact that ultimately we got through it. We bounced back. We always do bounce back, and this is okay. And this clearly, this happens, and it's normal, and that's okay. Um, so I just think that that's a really good one. I think it's good for anyone to do, really, kind of just reflect on those times that, okay, things seem tough. That's okay. We have a collection of those things and we always come back better than before. Um, Going on to another activity.
Before we do that, I wanted to stress that bounce back box idea that you had, Dan, is that I like this idea because then it allows the student to recall not only the hard moments, but I think it's a good thing visually because then they get to see like, wow, there were like 20 things that I bounced back on. Like I had some things that maybe looking back now are not so big, but also some bigger things that I can appreciate now that I move forward from. So they can make that assessment in hindsight to be like, okay, so what were some things that I was really stressed about that maybe now I have a better perception on, but then also recognize that they are more resilient than they thought they'd be. So let's move on to the next slide.
Absolutely. Another one is just taking movement breaks, any kind of movement break. I feel with a perfectionist student or, with students in general, kind of, it can be easy to just really dig on something for too long, you know, especially if you're, I picture writing a paper, and if you're going over the paper over and over again, looking for these things where it's like, this needs to change. Oh, I need to work on this. Oh, this didn't add up. You know, you can sit there and you can spend unlimited amounts of time on that. Um, and so encouraging these types of breaks, or even if I don't know, again, what this looks like or ways that this can be worked in, into the setting that you are working with, but trying to notice when maybe, okay, we've been spending a long time on something. Let's, before moving on, let's take a minute, let's dance, put some music on, let's dance, or just shaking it out, you know, um, or even just doing some basic stretches. These are really good, to just take a step back, get some movement, get some blood flowing, and stop thinking about whatever it is we've really been drilling in on. So then when it comes time to go back, we can kind of be a little refreshed, and feel a little bit better about moving forward. Um, spending too much time on one thing is certainly going to, just add to the pressure, and add to the makes it harder and harder to actually think that what we're doing is good, and continue to do productive work in that way.
I'd also like to add that there is neuroscience around this as well. So um, when we think about breaking through anxiety, anxiety tends to cause tension in the body, like muscle tension, shallow breathing, racing heartbeat. And when our bodies are alerted to an anxious signal, we will think so as well. So we go into that fight and flight mode. And in doing so, we're going to make ourselves pretty small, especially if our initial reaction is to freeze. But when using a wiggle or a dance or a stretch break, we're actually using a somatic experience a technique, which is actually used for individuals who experience extreme anxiety or trauma. And it allows them to feel more grounded in their bodies because the anxiety can really kind of float them away based on that futuristic thinking or on their perspective about how their performance is internally. And in doing the movement breaks, it allows the body information that we are in a safe situation. We are able to claim the space that we have because when we are feeling tight, we get smaller. So if you think about the last time that you felt really anxious or overwhelmed, how much of your muscles were tightened? Did you notice that you were taking up less space? And so this allows that particular student to um, let their body and their brains know that through this information, they're okay. And when we try to move that tension out in our bodies, we start to loosen up a little bit. We change the way that we feel. So there is a biofeedback perception that happens in this particular intervention, which I do find it to be also helpful when working with clients who are working through an anxiety or a panic attack. And they notice the difference between when their anxiety made them feel tense comparatively to when their body's relaxed.
And speaking of which, this is, more of a specific example of this. This is called the I am tree, grounding technique. Um, I think this one is really good because it also provides this kind of visual, and it's something that you can really, connect to in that way. Um, so I mean, no pressure if you want to get up and try it, as we go here. But basically, it's, you kind of go through this. You stand up, right, and you stand really tall and firm, plant your feet into the ground, okay, and feel your feet rooted in the dirt and on the ground, and picture your toes as roots, noticing that your back is strong and you are a strong trunk that is keeping you stable, and feeling your arms reach out into the air and your fingers like leaves rustling in the breeze, right? I am a tree. Um, Going through this, I again not only serves as this kind of movement break, but this is a good one that if you really get into it, um, picturing yourself as this stable tree, and knowing that you are, you're stable and you're planted, um, is a really good one, to again kind of take your mind off and also get your body, more in touch with itself, to be able to then move on and, take a better step forward after that. And there's lots of these. There is lots of these. You can search the internet for hours, going through different kind of, grounding techniques that you think might be more, you know, suitable for you if you don't like this one in particular. And there's some other ones as well, which we're going to show on that next slide. So this is another one that's really good. This one is, although less movement based, very much works similarly to, kind of take you out of whatever it is that you're hung up on, and really bring you back in touch with your body and in touch with yourself by engaging those five senses. Um, so taking a moment to address, like, okay, what are five things around that you can see? What are four things you can touch? Things you can hear, two things you can smell, and maybe something you could taste, if you can try to identify a taste. Um, this is a really, like I said, this is a good one as well, because you can do it anywhere at any time, and there's always going to be something, right? And this is a good one to work and do with students as well, whether they're, touching the desk, or, you know, hearing a pen or pencil, writing on a paper. These things really help reconnect, and gather in that way. Um, so like I said, in engaging the senses, again, a very good way to kind of bring back to where we are, refresh, and be able to move forward. Then another thing is reframing things in general. Like we talked about before, there's, a lot of reasons why these thoughts might be there. But ultimately those thoughts have been growing. And so we kind of have to take this thought that maybe has existed for some amount of time and try to kind of restructure it a little bit, reframe the idea. So one thing I think, especially if there's anxiety or panic around a specific task or a test, or, something in the moment or upcoming like that, you know, are you going to think about this a week from now? And okay, if maybe you'll think about it a week from now, but what about a month? And what about a year? Looking at things this way in general is going to kind of help you realize, okay, this thing that I'm really worked up about, and, I'm really panicky about doing well. And I want this to be perfect, and I'm going over and over in my head. Um, the reality is that a month to a year or some amount of time in the near future, this event is not going to feel so heavy. It's not going to feel as significant as it does right now. And although it may take time, kind of reframing things that way is going to start to make a change, because then maybe they'll begin to think that themselves next time something comes up. Well, yeah, I guess I won't think about it a month from now, right? So I guess I can get through this. This is okay. Um, Similarly, if we are identifying that, you know, perfection is the problem, right? In a way, we can kind of like, what is perfect? What does perfect look like? You know, um, and also ask that question: what would the world look like if everything was 100% perfect? You know, if it does exist or could exist, what is it? You know, and ultimately, the reality is that almost nothing. It's hard to identify things that are truly 100% perfection, right? And also with that, I don't know how exciting the world would be, right? If everyone was perfect all the time, we're cookie cutter, and everyone does the same things and everyone's super good at it, and the world is just running like this, well, we're going to kind of lose a lot of what we like about this life, right? And about the world. And kind of reframing things in that way is good too. Just be like, okay, we're striving for perfection, but is that something that we really want and we need? You know, is perfection truly a goal um, in this way? You know, is that something we want? So, and then similarly, um, kind of similar to the bounce back box, right? Kind of just asking, reflecting on it, if there ever was a time in which you weren't good at something, but you are now, you know, because I think that's something that's forgotten a lot too. When you are striving for perfection, specifically looking at any kind of learning process or educational, you know, academic achievement goal, you kind of forget that at some point you didn't know how to do what you know how to do. And it's important to kind of look back and go, hey, I, once upon a time, I couldn't do this simple math equation. Once upon a time, I didn't know how to write a paper. So what happened? Okay, well, you do make these learning mistakes or have these learning opportunities, right? And then you apply them and you get better and you get better and you get better. And it's uphill from there. But when you're kind of stuck in this idea that, okay, it has to be perfect, then it's really hard to, again, look back and reflect on those times that, you had to learn at some point. So then kind of reinforcing and reiterating that it's like, this is normal and this is also desired, in a way. Part of education is not perfection. Perfection isn't the goal. It's, learning and applying is really what we're looking for here, right? So then reinforcing, okay? There's different ways we can do this, right? One, in staying in line with this idea of that, like, okay, making mistakes is good because it offers learning opportunities, right? And that's really what education is. Maybe we need to take a moment sometimes and make some intentional mistakes. Sometimes we forget that, again, we need to experience things on a lighter note. Not everything has to be so critical. So even if it's something to like write something really silly, when I think of this, I even think I think of Mad Libs. Okay, just like taking a minute, coming up with something goofy, some goofy narrative where you're kind of purposely making a mistake or purposely making something really silly, to kind of showcase that and have a moment where making the mistake really is a fun and okay thing. Um, or even going through and like spelling something wrong, as a joke, and, kind of just having a moment to make some intentional mistakes like that, can be good to, again, just kind of alleviate some of that pressure and give a reminder that it's like, this is okay. There can be some light moments within these mistakes that we make. Additionally, if I understand, possibly deadlines can be an issue here as well. If students are kind of hanging on to their stuff, not wanting to turn it in. So again, many of you may have your own ways of dealing with this, but rewarding meeting those deadlines in some way is also a positive thing. Okay. Whether it's something like a piece of candy, right? Or, I don't know, a cool bookmark or a cool pen or any kind of thing that can be done to kind of reward, like, okay, the goal here is we want you to turn it in. All right. We don't want you to hang on to it forever and then we can't grade it and never give you feedback. Setting up some reward system for that is a really positive thing to show, like, okay, maybe I actually do want to meet this deadline. There is something desirable at the end of turning this in. Similar to before, just encouraging breaks in general. Even if this is something that you're not directly enforcing with these kind of grounding techniques or these stretch breaks or anything like that in the classroom, I'd make an effort to just encourage that on their own. I understand that after class, they're sent and they have this extended time where they're working on their stuff, right? Or they're doing homework. Now, once they leave the classroom, it's going to be really easy to go right back to the typical behavior, which is to, just try to grind something out for hours and hours and hours and then try to make it perfect, right? So hearing it from you too, to just encourage breaks, even if it was something like, try to tell them, okay, you can spend an hour and a half on something, but after an hour and a half, you need to take 20 minutes or something, let them know that breaks are important. It's important to step away. Additionally, going back to that idea that academic achievement may be their prized thing, right? Or their set thing that they're hoping to gain, and it's their sense of identity, it's their sense of worth in this way. We want to encourage things that aren't academic. You know, who are they outside of that? Do they have hobbies? Do they have other things that they can spend their time doing? If the idea, this ties in, if taking a break would be something difficult, it could even be helpful to just replace it with something also enjoyable that's not academic, where it's drawing or, playing a game, anything. We want to kind of reinforce this idea that, although this is important, and it is important to, do this, and of course you want to do well, it's not everything, it's not the only thing. So trying to reach them on that kind of level can be really big too. And I know that may be difficult sometimes as well, because I understand that at the end of the day, it's like, there's a curriculum, there's a job you're trying to do, and then they have their job that they're trying to do. But any kind of like reaching into their world, and kind of seeing what else is going on there can be really useful for kind of pulling away from these tendencies. So moving on, okay. So with that, being vulnerable is very important. In the same way, we may want to make intentional mistakes for fun, show that it's light. It's also important to know that, you're human, right? And you make mistakes too. And it can be really helpful for them to know that. It can be really helpful for them to get an idea of like, well, I make mistakes all the time, or I used to be awful at this subject in school, or, giving this more kind of personalized idea that you're like them, you've been there, you've had struggles, and you also have persevered, and it's okay. and be honest with who you are outside of the setting. Um, I think that, you know, a lot of times it can be a student looks at a teacher as just that, right? The teacher. So kind of understanding outside who they are outside of that, and that they are just like a normal person. Um, it can be a really big thing. I see there's a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a question. One of the things that I'm thinking about as we're going along is we have a lot of deadlines here at school. And so is it ever possible or productive to be a little more direct and firm? And, you know, Joey, that you are, that this is, we want to affirm all the things that are going on, and we appreciate all of the some of the tactics that you're saying. But then, do we ever say this is it? It's due Wednesday, and if you can't get this in, we got to move on. And so you're going to get a 0 or a very low grade. And I'm rolling into the next. We got 4 sessions left. That kind of thing. Does it depend on the student? Can he ever be that blunt or direct? What do you think?
I do think that it can depend on the student, right? If like what you're saying, right, is like if the goal is you're trying to affirm everything and you're trying to like, be accommodating and be understanding of what the situation is, some students are not going to necessarily take as well to that bluntness, right? But at the same time, I do also understand that, like what you said, there's deadlines, right? So to some degree, I get that too. There is kind of a natural consequence to the deadline, right? Obviously, if it doesn't get in, this is what the deadline is. You're setting the expectation. They know what the expectation is, and if they don't meet it, there's a consequence for that. I I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. Obviously, that's your job, and you want the things to be turned in, and it's not your responsibility if that doesn't happen necessarily, right? So I guess within that, it's just you can maintain bluntness while also still being sensitive to whatever the student is going through, right? You can say like, okay, and you try to work with them like, I understand, so hey, this deadline's coming up, I'm not going to budge on that because this is what the expectation is, right? But I guess trying to look for ways to, how can we make sure this happens? How can we make this a better experience so it maybe doesn't feel as crushing? But at the same time, you do have a deadline to meet, and there are consequences to that. So I get that.
Yeah, to add to that, I'd say maybe the follow-up talk to the deadline is just as important as holding the deadline. You have a blunt talk to say this deadline is pretty firm, we can't move this, and we'll do all we can in the next 4 days to meet it. And then if they don't meet it, or they turn in something and they're totally distraught about it because it's not as perfect as they want, also doing the follow-up to it too. You move on to the next thing and you say, we kind of failed to meet this deadline on this particular project. We got through steps 1 through 4, but steps 4, 5 and 6 didn't quite happen. Let's talk about that. Why do you think that happened? What can we do next time to avoid that? Jumpstart a new project, try it again. And just having consistent daily conversations maybe about that. Okay, the last project went good up to this point, but then we dropped the ball in the last few days. How can we avoid that again? Let's try again. So you can still be firm and hold your own kind of natural consequences, but also the follow-up and the feedback of how do we learn from this and avoid it again in the future, kind of thing.
I think that can be very helpful. And it also, for that particular child, whether we notice that there's a pattern that they do good halfway through the project, and then it's like the second half that they start to falter. Do we need to chunk that into smaller deadlines so that it's not just this big deadline that we are moving towards, so that they can still see the progress that they're making and we can still assess where they're at? And I agree with you, is that there has to be natural consequences to a behavior, right? Because in other settings, they may not have the ability to make deadlines shift outside of the classroom, right? And so we also want to prepare them for what may happen to them when they do have these rigid deadlines, and how can they use the skills that they have to help them understand that a bigger project can be broken down to smaller pieces so that they can see the progression. But then I think the other piece here is, and what a lot of students struggle with is that when they are working through their perfectionism, they are trying to figure out, how can I have a connection with other people? How will people see me outside of this if I don't perform well all the time, right? And so part of this conversation is to have with them and to say, like, I know that you want to do really well, but I think at the end of the day, you want others to be proud of you. You want to be proud of yourself. You want to be, as we were talking about I think it was the beginning slides, about like which level of perfectionism that they fell into. Those are their personal goals. Those are their goals of wanting to connect with other people. And to remind them that, yes, part of this is their way that they perform, but at the end of the day, it's also about the other stuff that makes up who they are. And that's the piece that we're missing too. So let's focus on, yes, getting through all of these pieces, but at the end of the day, you're still an awesome person. You're still a hardworking person. You're still really resilient. And this is just a small part of what shows to be the true you.
Yeah. And some of the feedback talk I've had that are similar to this, okay, we missed a deadline or we didn't quite get through the finish line. There's a big stressing of like, and by the way, 75% of our project construction, this went really well. You did this well. I saw you do this and I really loved that. Let's keep that up. I want you to keep that up. Also, I guess one last question. Do you recommend, I've done this before, do you recommend, like, I will defer the reason that I'm holding this natural consequence to future possibilities? So by that, I mean, if I tell the student, hey, I'm holding this deadline and I know it's tough and it's going to be a crunch to get there, but I'm doing this because you've told me that one of your personal goals is to go and thrive at a 4-year college, let's say. I can personally tell you they're going to have hard deadlines and highly weighted projects there that I don't want you to fail at. So we're going to hold this deadline now. I'm holding you to this expectation right now because there's a safety net here. We can have conversations. We can figure these things out. But right now is the time to test out workflows and project management so that when you're in college, there's a hard deadline, at least somewhat what to do. Like I kind of talk about that hypothetically in the future. Is that a healthy thing to do with somebody who has over perfectionism, or is that not necessarily recommended?
Dan, do you want to answer that first, or would you like me to take that?
Yeah, we can take turns here. I think that's great. As simply, because the reality is that that's reality. And so being able to frame that is important, right? And it is good to be able to say that, like, hey, this is what you're saying you want to achieve. I'm here to help you achieve that. This is what has to happen. Right. Now the reality is, again, right, we are talking about, different individuals. So in the same way that, different people will respond differently to that, I think that can be very anxiety provoking, right? But at the same time, it is helpful, and you're still doing what you're seeing as good, right? So I think that you are right with this kind of like more of the follow-up as far as that goes, right? When you're framing something in that way, saying like, okay, this is why I'm sticking to these deadlines, because you're saying you want this and this is what's going to help you. That's fantastic. Just see what happens with that, right? Some students may not have a problem. Some may have some more issues with that. And then you can kind of follow up, which it sounds like you're already trying to do, which I do think is really positive. So.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was just wondering with perfectionism, specifically, like if that's something that's a big, if I'm accidentally hitting a trigger, or something like that. but that's fair. It's case by case. I understand.
And I think the
Yeah.
other part here is to have that conversation with the student before projects are due, right? So
Right,
if the
right.
goal is to develop this habit to stick to a hard deadline, how are we going to parcel that out,
Yeah,
right?
it's a
Do we want to
series of
see, like, just don't like surprise them afterwards and say
Right.
like, this is why we're,
Yeah, no.
okay.
No, yeah, usually here at the Fusion model, we like to do co-construction a lot. So if we set up a unit project that's going to be due 4 weeks out, 4 weeks prior to the deadline, I'm typically taking a whole session, and a lot of teachers do this here, where we put together a Google Doc of the expectations. What is it we want at the end? How do we get there in steps? And then I don't know if we have done mini deadlines, but then the big deadline. And so they're part of like usually the construction of expectations, which helps get buy-in too. So, and then it's just a series of conversations.
Yeah, because I think that the more that you have buy-in with that, and then the mini deadlines with it, along with the rewards, it makes it easier to kind of stick with the deadline comparatively to having just one big project deadline at 4 weeks, because 4 weeks may seem like a long time, but we all know that it isn't. And the passage of time is different from how we perceive it as well as the student we are working with. So there's that shift that we also need to be mindful of.
Okay. Thank you so much for the information. Just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
Thank you.
Of course, thanks for asking. It's really, good question, So, with that, like I said, prior to that, being vulnerable and being honest, I guess that's an example too, right? Of even using something like that. Okay, this personal experience of your own to kind of reinforce what it is you're trying to say. Like, okay, if you do have a situation like that too, okay, you're saying you want to be successful at college. Well, guess what? I went to college, right? So let's talk about my experience with that. And just, I say in general, just kind of sending it home that, there are things about you that identify you outside of the teacher role, and that can bring a little more of an kind of inclusion. A student may be a little more forthcoming, and it can make working with them a little easier. Okay. We can move forward. I have several links throughout, but I plan to share this out then, and we can go back to seeing how we are on time at the end here. Okay. So like I said, remembering how you're seen by your students, or trying to think about how you're seen by your students, can be important. Again, with this idea that it can be daunting to look at a teacher or faculty member and just look at them as that single identifying piece, that they are this successful, power person that's telling me what I need to do. So kind of breaking that down is helpful. And then again, trying to be mindful of the fact that there are a lot of reasons why these students may have these traits. And entering into their world at all can be very helpful to understanding it, and then helpful to managing it. This presentation is kind of just a general look, right, at things that can be helpful. But as we've been kind of talking about, right, every student is different. Every situation is different. There's not a clear answer for everyone, but being able to kind of reach into their life at all and understand anything about what is bringing that on for them can be really useful in then being able to turn around and trying to help them along as you're all trying to meet your own goals and everything else. So moving on, those are some things obviously that can be done in person in the classroom. I do have some things here that may be helpful outside of the classroom. And this goes not just for, perfectionist students, but any students with any kind of thing going on at all, right? If it's an anxious student or any kind of emotional regulation issue is kind of present at all. I found for kind of younger populations, we have Nixie and Nimbo. With the Child Mind Institute, there's a whole series of videos there that kind of goes through and they kind of go on an adventure together, but then they find out and they talk about anxiety and talk about different things and how they deal with that and reframe it. And it's like a cartoon. I think that's a really good one. For kind of an older population, teenagers, Peak Your Mind. They are another one. They have a whole YouTube channel. There's lots of helpful videos there. So even if you wanted to look and try to find a particular video for a student, or even just tell students in general, hey, you should check this out, this YouTube channel, if you have free time, or even that can be used in your break time, right? Okay, I want you to take a break from your homework. Well, why don't you shoot over and watch a video real quick? There's a lot of really helpful stuff there. And then similarly, for either your use or again for this kind of recommended use, Headspace is an incredible resource I love to use. I love to use it with clients as well. There are tons of meditations, tons of different types of meditations. There's stuff for anxiety. There's stuff for kind of the body awareness. There's ones for sleep. If you think you have a student who's pulling all-nighters because they're working on stuff and not getting enough rest, there's a lot of sleep-directed stuff there as well, and a lot of them can be found on YouTube. So these are, again, resources we can send out that I think are very worth looking into for, like I said, either your own use or just kind of recommending for them to go explore on their own. And then finally, just wrapping up, if there's any more final questions, again, with those resources and stuff as well, I think another part, which I know it can be difficult, and I don't know the level of kind of intimacy you do achieve with like the parents or how deep things can go with students. So I would encourage these resources if you think it could be helpful to share these with parents as well. Anything that they can help out. But was there any final questions, any comments?
Here's one quick one, and I know we're probably up against it on time. I just want to throw out to you. We had a scenario, so a lot of what you're talking about definitely applies to specific students that I know many of us can think about, we've worked with. One tactic that we took with one student, and we've already done it, so you could tell us if this was the right move or not, but we had a student who was a senior, meaning the timelines are even more tight because there's an ending point where you got to be done to have a final transcript and everything. And this student was in final assignments in the way of papers. Like we need writing out of this student. And she was not turning it in because of a lot of the things that, was at the front end of this presentation. So what we ended up doing was creating Google Docs, where it's a shared document between student and teacher, where she would then type her drafts in. And we did this, and it's sort of a sneaky thing, but we did it so that way she didn't get to say if she was turning it in or not. She was just working in it, and then we just took it. And we did that because, number one, we needed the work because we do, we need to wrap the classes up, but also because the work that she was doing that she felt was subpar, or that, she was worried about for, dealing with perfectionism, it was great work. We just needed to get it from her and she wouldn't turn it in. So we sort of tricked her into turning it in, and I would just love to hear what your all thoughts are on that tactic that we took.
Okay. I'll say I'm mixed on it. Part of me thinks that that's awesome. Obviously it worked. You know, not a bad idea, right? When you're just trying to come up with ways to kind of work that along and get it done. I guess I'm curious, like, obviously you're saying, like, if it was all in a Google Doc, right? She was aware that you were seeing it, right?
Yeah, it was a shared document between student and teacher.
Right.
The student could make annotations on a text and things like that. So then we're able to say, okay, you just did work. Like, that's good work. And now we're just taking it and grading it. And it got a really good grade.
Sure.
It's solid work. It's just that, we're doing that because we couldn't just leave it to the student to upload it, the way students would typically upload their work in the grading portal. That wasn't happening, not because the student didn't want to do the work or anything like that, solely because she couldn't bring herself to turn it in out of fear that it wasn't good enough.
Sure. I mean, I think the fact that they're at least, like, obviously there's the awareness that, like, you're seeing all the work, you're seeing all the progress. I don't think that's a bad then. You know what I mean? Like, you're to say that, like, you tricked her. It's like yes and no, because at the end of the day, she knew you could see the work.
Right. Teacher
and
could
so
see
you
the work,
graded what you saw.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty innovative. It's a good use of technology, as far as that goes. Mary Ann, do you have any comments to that?
I kind of think about that as a reframe, right? Instead of saying the traditional route of, we're going to have this assignment and you need to have all these deadlines to do said assignment, we reframed it to, we're just going to have this as a working document. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to keep, moving forward. Yeah, there's a deadline, but just kind of do what you're doing here. And so you place the focus on, we just want you to do the work as opposed to the deadline. So then the behavior shifted from, oh my God, there's a deadline, to, oh, okay, well, I'm just kind of putting things together, right? So there's no pressure for that student to perform at a certain level because they perceived it as being, we're just kind of working along, right? Now, while you got the work out of her, what I think is pretty awesome, I would have a conversation with the student to be like, how helpful was that when we perceived it as being as something that was kind of like this working document, and it wasn't something that you were putting additional pressure on yourself to perform well at? Because we both recognize that, come college, you may not have the flexibility to, extend deadlines in your college courses, but you were able to demonstrate to us that you were, working hard, that you submitted great work, that you are a hard worker, you kept at it, right? And those are the qualities that are going to make you successful in college, not about the grade. And I think that a lot of students, and I get it, like, a lot of it is GPA focused. I know that there is an issue with grades and financial aid. And I know that having stellar grades is one of the things that kind of puts you into college. I do appreciate that point. On the other hand, here is that we're also telling the student that that's all that you need to perform at. When really, in actuality, when they do get into college, they're going to have varied experiences with varied professors who would want different things. And it's not going to be the same level of intensity amongst classes. The thing here is to perceive, like, what is going to be the goal of the particular outcome? Well, I want to graduate. Well, who is, as we were talking about earlier, who's going to remember your grades in high school? They want to see your high school diploma. Who's going to ask you for what you got in college chemistry in the workforce? Well, nobody. They want to make sure that I graduated, right? So let's focus on what the goal is and not so much upon what the immediate I want to have straight A's goal, which again, it's a lofty goal. It's an admirable goal. But at the same point, it's not to override what our health is or what our ultimate goal is, which is, go to college, get a job.
No, Ben, I saw you had a question.
Yeah, so just I guess with perfectionism and how it relates to obsessive compulsive thinking and catastrophization and things like that. If a student is like going down that spiral path of, well, if I don't get this done, XYZ is going to happen, things are going to get monumentally worse with each missed deadline or whatever. I guess I'm looking for strategies to kind of nip that sort of spiral in the bud, so that it's to kind of stop it before they're just spending all their time thinking about potential consequences for something that hasn't happened yet.
Sure. Well, this is where I guess some of these other things come in. I guess it depends, right? Because obviously it's like you're only with them for X amount of time, and you can only try to control what you can in those moments. If you're with a student and they are presently going through that type of spiral, that is where some of these things come in, and stopping them and taking a moment to do some of these grounding exercises, or pulling them away to try to even depending on where they're at, I guess their age and their ability. I mean, you could even work with them to kind of just like break down what their thought is.
Sure. I guess I worry about being like insensitive to an irrational fear or something by pointing out that it won't happen or whatever that may be.
So for example, that would be.
And I think we were.
For example,
Marianne.
what kind of thought would that be? What would be the irrational fear?
I don't like, if I were to not hand in my homework, then I don't know, I'm going to end up whatever, homeless, dead, like if I step on this irrationally, that'll cause my mom to get hurt or whatever, just kind of irrational fears that are attached to perfectionism, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I can add on to that, Ben, I feel like you're kind of touching on something that we've had students have. It's not necessarily that direct line of, if I don't turn in this work, I'm going to fail and then I'm not going to get into college. It's like, it turns into, and they may not be verbalizing it, but they're starting to say like, well, the homework's not good enough. And it's like, okay, but it is. But if I don't do this, if I don't title it this way, or if I don't finish the thesis statement, then Matthew, a teacher here, who would never do this, he's gonna yell at me, and then what's gonna happen is I'm gonna have to do it again, and so then you can kind of start to see that they are trailing into that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to like Ben's point, that's such a good question of like, yeah, do we stop them and say like, hey, no, like that's not going to happen, or is that just being insensitive to their reality?
I would not say that's being insensitive to the reality, but I would have them walk you through that. Okay, so if you say like this is going to happen, so tell me exactly how it's going to happen, right? And so they tell you this whole spiraling thing, right? And then we're like, okay, so that's the anxious brain telling you that this is going to happen, right? And our anxious brain doesn't always have the right answers. When our brain is calm, it doesn't think this way, right? And so when I look at this scenario with you, and I think that I've known you for a little bit, and I know your situation and know your relationships with your teachers, I would suspect that X, Y, and Z is going to happen. However, your anxious brain is telling you the opposite. What has past experience shown you that it's going to be this particular scenario that you are describing? they may share some of the things that have actually been traumatic for them, that have like started that stinking thing. I call it stinking thinking, the stinking thinking spiral. And then it gives you a sense as to how rooted the anxiety is. And that's why it's so hard for them to kind of move forward in what they're doing. And I'm not asking anybody to be a therapist here, that I know that you're pretty well versed in what you're doing and you're doing wonderful work with the students, but this is something that can be deferred to with a mental health professional to help them break down that past anxiety mixed with trauma response, because what you're having here is a trauma response too. Your brain is already getting into that fight and flight response, and so we're responding as though we're in a threat, right? And so as Dan was saying, is that maybe we need to take a moment, take a few breaths. Let's do some, distraction activity for a little bit. Let's come back to that. And let's kind of assess, when you are feeling a little bit more calmer, are you still feeling this way? Because when you're in that anxiety response, you don't see anything outside of what that anxiety is saying. So even when you are saying, no, that's not right, realistically, their frontal lobe and their brain is shut off, so they're not able to understand logistical or rational reasoning. And so we need to bring them back into their bodies to de-escalate what they're feeling, so that their frontal lobe can be back online and be more receptive to what the solutions are. So doing more of the grounding things would be helpful, to do a little bit of like the breaks. Let's do a timeout right now. Maybe we need to do a thought dump. And sometimes this works with students, sometimes it doesn't, just depends on the student, in which they dump all of their anxious thinking on a page or on the screen. And then we kind of assess, okay, so does that actually make you feel a little bit better because it's now outside of you, or is this making you more anxious? But I would say that, you would know your students best to know which ones would be open to that and which ones would not be. But in doing that de-escalation with the student first, and then being able to kind of look at this in a different way, can help them understand that their anxious brain has a different way of problem solving than their calm brain. Did I lose people?
I'm still here. Thank you very much for that. That was
Okay. Does that
Well,
help?
great.
Or
And
did yeah.
And I just want to reiterate one thing Marianne said again. It's like, you can't be therapists, and you're not expected to be. So again, it's like, you can only do what you can do. So I could understand though, where it's like being in that position is very difficult, right? If you have a student who is going down that path and you're just like, oh, okay, it is hard to manage that and hard to redirect that. And, it is, yeah, it's like, it's not your job to try to completely play the mental health therapist and play the teacher and, do all this. So, I appreciate what you're doing and the question with that too. Did anyone else have any questions or anything they wanted to talk about?
Hi there. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, sorry, I'm driving right now. So I have a question regarding, so I definitely have perfectionistic tendencies myself, and I've definitely worked on them with therapists and with teachers and whatnot over the years, trying to become
Hunter, I don't know if you can hear us. You're kind of breaking up now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
that they do. For example, like I knew the materials. All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, a lot better.
Hello. Okay. Sorry. I would not turn in homework because I get probably 100% on it, but because I didn't have enough time to actually finish the homework, I didn't even want to start it and to turn it in. And so I've seen that with some of my students before too. But I guess what I'm asking is like, how do I, as a teacher who recognizes my own perfectionism sometimes, how do I mitigate, I guess, showing my perfectionistic tendencies to students and like displaying it in a way that not glorifies it, but makes it seem like, oh, well, because I also try to relate with them too. I'm like, I notice you're a perfectionist. I am too. This is how I work through it. But I also don't want them to think like, oh, Hunter's a perfectionist. He did this and this in school or whatever. He's doing this now. I also have to be a perfectionist if I want to do that. So I guess how do I prevent showing my perfectionism to students in a negative way?
I think you can talk about your experience in a global way without saying it's you. I think that when you connect with people who have struggled the same way that you have, they get the inkling that you've been there. And I think part of this is to sometimes give them the language about what that experience is like, because it's very hard to share that with other people. Like when you're ridden with anxiety, you don't want to share that. You don't want to admit that you're in a constant state of fear and a constant state of panic, and that you're always like over assessing, or that you are constantly thinking about a scenario over and over and over again because people think that's weird, right? Or they think that, well, there must be something wrong with you. And I think that part of this, and I've done this with students as well, is that you can share your experience by describing what that is. And it may not always fit, but they follow the same kind of like theme and language. And so they're like, oh, you kind of get it, right? And then we can also say that, you know, given this particular scenario and in what you choose to share, I've also recognized that it's a very difficult experience, and sometimes you really have to work hard at, I call it again, stinking thinking thoughts. Really kind of like honing in on the stinking thinking thoughts, rewiring that anxious brain so that you're not focusing on the same thing over and over and over again. So that you're subtly kind of giving them hints as to what may be something that you may want to work on with that perfectionism, because, you know, anxiety in and of itself is not a bad thing. Developmentally, and even from an evolutionary standpoint, we need to have some level of anxiety to do things. Right. If we had no anxiety, we'd be not motivated to do anything, right? Yeah. And so part of this is to help them establish, like, you know, anxiety is going to be a part of life. But when we are into the excessive piece of that, it changes the way that we perceive reality, right? And so I'm not looking at things clearly. I'm not looking at things from a holistic viewpoint. I'm only focusing on a few puzzle pieces that are in this whole picture. But if I realize that I need to kind of open my eyes a little bit more, I need to work on, you know, taking some deep breaths, and I need to work on expanding my thought process and challenging the stinking thinking thoughts, I can start to see things a little bit clearly. So I think that you can subtly kind of like also point them in the direction of, you know, yeah, there's some benefits to being a perfectionist, but there's a lot of things that kind of go with it that I don't really like either. Right. And that's some things that I still struggle with, or in your own way, or however that you choose to share that. But, you know, I've noticed that, you know, when I work on that, or when I've seen people work on those particular things, it's not as bad. And they feel a little bit better, and they feel more confident about themselves. And so then you're planting that seed, if you will, to show them that there is a connection, that you see them, but you're not being the therapist, and you're not also telling them what to do, but you're showing them the reality of what it can look like long term, because you've been there. You have experience that you can impart on them, that as where they are right now, that they can change. And I like to share with and I like to share with students is that the more that you work on it now, the less severe and the less like insidious it's going to be as an adult. And so that can be more motivating because they're like, oh, like I can change this now. Yeah, you can definitely change this now.
Yeah, and like I'm still here. I live, like and I'm obviously it didn't defeat me, it didn't hurt me.
No, yeah.
And I was able, so it's like, yeah, okay, that's good. Thank you.
Dan, did you want to add to that?
No, you summed it up pretty good there. So
Oh, well, thank you.
I'm glad. Anyone else?
Oh, I see there's something in the chat. I'm sorry, I didn't check the chat.
Oh.
Ben, did you still have a question?
No,
That was earlier. We answered it.
Oh, we did earlier? Okay. What I wanted to let everyone know is that we can make these slides available to you and to the rest of the faculty who are not able to spend time with us. You are more than welcome to email Dan and I about any follow-up questions or any content that you would like for us to kind of explore further, or if you have an additional questions about performance anxiety or anxiety in general. We wanted to thank you for the opportunity to present today. It was a wonderful group. I could see everybody was engaged, even though I really couldn't see everybody's faces. And we had some awesome questions. But again, like if you need any other support afterwards, please let us know.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, and if you could, I think you have Mike's email. So if you want to shoot the slide deck over to him, he can get it out to the team.
I can do that. And I'm going to go ahead and stop share now.
Well, thank you both very much for presenting, and we'll let everyone know to shoot any questions that may come up over the course of as we start our fall term.
All right. Thank you.
thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you guys. Appreciate it.